What's up, Tsla family? It's Ray J back with another video. And in this one, I want to break down what's happening with SPY, Tesla, and the overall markets. I'm going to break down why tomorrow is going to be a very important day, as it's going to be the last day of October for trading. And what's happening so far in the after hours as we have big tech earnings affecting the way the market's moving. Just know that I am not a financial planner, so take nothing I'm saying as financial advice. So as far as the market's going, we had a very, very interesting amount of volatility the last couple of days. We started off with Jerome Powell, who said some things that caused the market to dip and then bounce. Then we had big tech earnings that caused some downside, and the market dipped even more with President Trump and President Xi Jinping's meeting in South Korea because of some things which I'm going to discuss. And now the market's trying to bounce a bit with the big tech earnings again. So I'm going to break down everything going on one step at a time and why we are going to likely see a small bounce in Tesla stock as we're trying to stabilize at this 440 area. But this bounce may be very temporary, and there is still a risk of it coming back down to fill this gap over here. So I'm going to break down what's going to likely happen in my personal opinion in just a few minutes. Let's first talk about some news. Unfortunately, Tesla was hit with some negative news. Tesla is going to be recalling about 6,200 of their Cybertrucks in the USA because of an attached light bar that could fall and pose a road hazard to other vehicles, according to the NHTSA. Tesla, however, will install an additional mechanical attachment and replace the light bar for free, according to the NHTSA. This was not the best of news, and that's part of why Tesla saw some selling today. However, there's other factors as well for why Tesla sold off. Looking right now, Bank of America Securities has a neutral rating for Tesla. But historically, the price-price ratio is now dipping just a little bit as Tesla is losing some strength. And Fridays tend to be green about 50% of the time for Tesla. It's more of a 50-50 day. But keep in mind, tomorrow is going to be once again the last Friday of the month and also the last day of October. It's going to be Halloween, so get ready for some interesting moves. Now, Tesla basically saw a bit of a sell-off with some news that came out. We're going to start off with Jerome Powell. We have some important Fed chair candidates coming out who are saying that they think that Jerome Powell was being more hawkish than expected, which is true to some extent. Jerome Powell basically told us that there's no guarantee of a rate cut in December, as the Fed has to look at what's happening with the labor markets and other things like that. And because of the fact that there is a lot of uncertainty about the data, with the government shutdown, the Fed has to be very careful. Before, there was over a 90% chance we were going to get a 25 basis point cut from the Fed. Now it went down to 74.7%. So that's parts of why the market saw a bit of a sell-off. Jerome Powell was not entirely hawkish, though. He did say some dovish things, such as the fact that when you look at the labor market, it's still quite stable, firstly. And then secondly, he mentioned that with what's going on so far, the Fed will transition away from quantitative tightening by buying back treasury bonds very, very soon in December, which means that the Fed will once again ease up on policy, at least to some extent. And this is their way of stimulating the economy, given the risks that are involved. So, what does this mean? Jerome Powell, once again, was kind of like mixed in my view. He said some things that were bullish and some things that were a little bearish. The market was more reactive to the news that there's no guarantee of a rate cut in December, and that's why we saw more of a sell-off afterwards. On top of this, the market also sold off, after President Trump and President Xi Jinping of China met up. And what happened? Why did that happen? Here's the exact reason. So, first off, with the meeting that happened, President Trump said there was a lot of finalization, and on a scale from 0 to 10, he gave this a 12 in terms of how amazing the meeting was. Then he came out and mentioned that a deal could be signed pretty soon and that there were not too many major tumbling blocks that happened during the meeting. So the U.S. agreed to decrease tariffs by 10% on China, but China is going to work with the U.S. to help eliminate some problems. They also delayed their export controls on the rare earth materials by 1 year, which was some good news. The market knew about this, though. This was not necessarily a surprise. A lot of that was priced in. China also said that, according to President Trump, he claims that China is saying that they want to buy more U.S. soybeans after the halts that happened about a month ago. And then there's been more news coming out. But here's the thing that was not so great. There was no mention of a TikTok, Taiwan, or Nvda deal. There was nothing else like that. Even when President Trump was asked about this, he said they did not really discuss Nvda. So what does this mean? Overall, this was a productive meeting. It was necessary and very important between President Trump and President Xi Jinping, but we didn't really get that major wow factor. We didn't get that wow factor that was enough to get the market to pump if we had like a big Nvda deal or something else like that. And also keep in mind, they did not really sign the deal officially. They just agreed upon these things. President Trump said they could sign the deal pretty soon, and I think that's part of why the market sold off. That's why we saw a bit of a sell off today in the stock market. That's part of the reason why Tesla was down about 4.6%, right? The news involving China, the Fed's reaction, and then the negative news about the recall of the Cybertrucks that caused Tesla to dump quite a bit. However, it did try to bounce off that 440 area, and it's not just Tesla, the whole market is now trying to bounce. If you look at SPY, we're actually up about 0.6% in the after hours, and the reason this is happening is because of big tech earnings. So today we got Amazon, Apple, and Coinbase, which all announced their earnings. There was some good news for them. Amazon had better than expected earnings. The shares were up very sharply. We had an EPS of $1.95, beating expectations, with revenue at about 180 billion, beating expectations. We also ended up seeing the Amazon Web Services at about 33 billion in revenue, which saw some good growth. Their AI revenue is also looking quite strong, and we're looking for good demand in AI and core infrastructure with good guidance. So good job by Amazon. The share price is up like crazy. It's up like 13% right now. We'll double check in just a couple of minutes. And then for Apple, the share price is up about 5%. It also hit a historic $4 trillion market cap. We saw good growth overall, with revenue up 8% to $102.5 billion. And Tim Cook is predicting that China's revenue of sales is going to likely start to go up, especially for Q1. And then we're also looking for good guidance and nice increases in the iPhone 17 sales, as it's looking incredibly strong. That is bullish news. That's part of why Apple's in the green. Coinbase also beat expectations on EPS and revenue. The share price is up a bit. It's not that crazy though. And that's pretty much it for earnings. The earnings week is basically done, with just minor ones for tomorrow. And the market's going to likely see more positive reactions to Amazon and Apple. The two big ones are doing well. Now, tomorrow, it's going to be a significant day because it's going to be Friday, October 31st. We have Logan from the Fed giving a speech. We also have Bostic and Hammock as the day goes on. Nothing too significant comes out in terms of data, but it is going to be the last day of October, the last day of the month, the last October day of all of 2025, and it's going to be a Friday. And what is significant about that is that we have a 2.92 put to call option ratio, and we have millions of options expiring on SPY. This may cause some more volatility, so we're going to see what that leads to. Finally, the fear and greed index is currently at fear, as making up the majority of sentiment. Momentum is at greed, and the other indicators suggest that the VIX is dipping. It's currently like a little bit more neutral. So what do I think about the stock market? What do I think is going to happen? Because of the big tech earnings, I think we gap up tomorrow, but there is still a risk of Tesla coming lower, especially as we have this gap to fill down here. So please keep that in mind. There might be a temporary sell-off coming soon. But then we also have the shareholder meeting coming up next week, which could change things. But for now, Tesla is showing some weakness on the daily time frame and these other trends. So on the 4 hour, what's going to happen tomorrow is I think we most likely gap up tomorrow. If we're really bullish, you want to see Tesla get back above at least 450. If we reclaim 450 plus, I would not rule out an attempt for 455 to 460. If we're bearish, you want to see us lose 440. If that fills us, we have a gap to fill back down towards 434. So keep that in mind. Now, as far as Tesla's going, we may see a temporary bounce back up towards this 450 area. We could try to push a little bit higher as we gap up, and then we're going to see what happens as time goes on. If we get some kind of rejection to fill this gap down here, it would be very healthy if Tesla comes back down to fill this gap around 434 before we see another attempt to bounce again, or we could even dip a little bit more after that. So we'll see how it goes. But I do think that there is a risk of some temporary downside to start off the month of November. I think it would be very healthy if Tesla and the market come down just a little bit. And then once Tesla forms its bottom, with the shareholder meeting and such, we're going to be looking to see if we could form a nice bounce, a big recovery, and a big rally to finish off the year for new highs. That's what Tesla could be doing as time goes on. And this dip could be another buying opportunity. So I'm watching to see if there's a head and shoulders like pattern that's developing. That's my prediction for now on Tesla stock. Based off the trend we're seeing, I think that is the most likely possibility. So make sure you watch 450's resistance and 440's our support. We could bounce a bit before we continue to fall back down to fill that gap. For other tickers out there, we have SPY. Okay, SPY is also going to likely try to gap up right here, but I think that there are some gaps to fill. So if you look at SPY on the daily time frame, keep in mind, SPY has a gap down here at 677. There's another gap down here at 672. We haven't filled the gaps yet, but there is a risk of us filling them. And also, if we gap up tomorrow, there's going to be a third gap. So there's one gap if we gap up tomorrow, another gap down here. There's a lot of gaps below to fill. I would love it if we dip in November to fill those gaps, which could create another good buying opportunity for the end of the year. That's very, very possible. So do not, once again, forget about that. So just to be safe, if SPY loses 682, we're looking for a dip to fill the gap to 677. If SPY gets back above 686 or above, we're looking for a push. And if we break 690, we're looking for new all-time highs, which eliminates the downside risk. Tomorrow, we should gap up and go a little bit higher for like 686. And then we're going to see if we form like a double top here before it starts to turn back down, especially as we have this gap to fill. Look for a gap up, a small push and consolidation before this turns back down in the month of November, especially as we fill this gap back down to 677. Now, for Tesla, like I said before, it's going to likely follow the overall market. We have this head and shoulders like pattern. Could we bounce a bit? Yes, it's very possible. We try to push back up to like 450. Then we're going to see if this head and shoulders ends up developing on Tesla stock for a temporary move down. But keep in mind, this would be a buying opportunity that could be coming for the month of November after the shareholder meeting and after we get seasonality, which I will talk about in a later video. But this is what Tesla could be doing following SPY and the QQQ, right? It's not just SPY. Look at the QQQ, guys. Okay, let's say we do gap up tomorrow around 632 or above. Think about it. We're going to have one gap above. So if we gap up tomorrow, there's one gap below. A second gap would be down here at 617. A third gap would be down here at 611. There's a lot of gaps left on the QQQ to fill, and they're not that far away. Now, if we manage to break the all-time high and we get back above 638, of course, we could remain bullish. If we end up losing essentially 625, we could fill these two gaps down here. So we'll have to see how this goes. But I think this is what's going to likely happen. I think it's going to be a mix of both worlds. So tomorrow we're going to likely gap up and try to run a little bit, especially with all the option expirations. I think we try to squeeze close to all-time highs. I can't guarantee we're going to break all-time highs. If we break 638, we could remain bullish, but we might come a little bit short. And then there is going to be a risk of us kind of like consolidating up here tomorrow. And then we could eventually return back down to fill these gaps, especially at 617 on the QQQ, due to the fact that there is some downside risk and there are so many gaps that are left. And also because of the fact that we are already pumped so much with all this news involving FOMC and President Trump's meeting with, the Chinese president and such. So it would be very healthy to fill the gaps first to start off November, and then we see another end of November squeeze. That's what I'm thinking. I will talk more about that in a later video. For the IWM Russell 2000, I just want to mention that we have resistance right here at 247, and we have this support down here as we come back down to fill this gap. So we could bounce a bit, and then we're going to see if we could break 247. If not, there is going to be a risk of us returning to 240, if not this gap fill down here to 238, and we'll have to see how it goes from there. On ES, we have 6,900. That's going to be our resistance right here. We have support at 6,850. I would not be surprised if we bounce tomorrow. We're going to try to go for the lower 6,900s. I think there's a good chance of that happening. If we take out the all-time high, we could try to rally more, but if we come short, there's going to be a risk of us dipping back down to like 68.55. So please be very careful in case that ends up being the case. So watch that very closely in case we form sort of like a cup or an inverse cup and handle like this. That could also trigger more downside. So we might bounce tomorrow and consolidate. As long as we don't take out the all-time high, there is still a risk of us dipping. We have not fully filled this gap on ES. I think there's another gap when you look at the daily time frame. There's still this giant gap down here that has not been filled at this level down here in the lower 6,800s. I would like to see us pull back first before we try to bounce. NQ has an even bigger gap. So on NQ, there's a giant gap down here at 25,500. We're trying to bounce thanks to the big tech earnings. We could try to go a little bit higher for like 26,200 or so. We need to take out 26,400 to remain a lot more bullish. But in case we come short, and if we end up losing our 20 EMA, we could come back down to fill this gap first. I would like to see us do that in early November. And then that could be just another buying opportunity for us to rally towards the end of November. For Bitcoin, we're on a bit of a downtrend. but we are going to try to bounce back up to 109 to 110,000 in this range. Then we'll see if we get another rejection or not. So watch that very closely. For Tesla, like I said, there's a head and shoulders like pattern. Might bounce a little bit towards 450 tomorrow morning. It might gap up and try to run a bit before Tesla comes back down to fill this gap that's overnight and the second gap down here that forms. I think that's what Tesla will likely do for a pump and dump. For Nvda, if we lose 198, we're bearish, but if we break past 211, we're more bullish. Could bounce a bit for like 207 before it turns back down towards 198, and we'll see how it goes. On Aapl, we have resistance at this 280 area and support at 268. We're going to likely gap up on Aapl, which is great, but the question is, can Aapl hold above 280? If it doesn't, we could still turn back down to fill this gap. On Netflix, we are trying to pump right now. We have support at 1108 and resistance at 1137. So we're going to see if we pump a bit more towards 1100 and 1120 plus to push even more. And then we could be looking for more upside as well temporarily on Netflix towards 1137. MSTR may also try to bounce temporarily, getting back up to about 272, and we'll see if we get a rejection. Celsius may also try to push back up to 61.69, and we'll see how it goes for a temporary move up. Watch that very closely. Supermicro has 52 as our resistance and then 50 as our main support. That's our range. I think it's going to return to fill this gap down over here, though. So it might bounce a bit, but if it cannot take out the highs, there's still a risk of it turning back down towards 48. On Palantir, we're looking more bullish, at least for now, but keep in mind there's still a gap on the daily time frame that's over here. There's still some gaps to fill. 200 is a very psychological level. Can we hold above 200 or do we get a rejection off it? You want to be very careful. May retest 200. We're going to see if it rejects. If it does, be prepared for 191 to 186, and we'll see how it goes. Rivian has a nice rejection that's forming here. We also have resistance at 13.3. I do think we could be bouncing a little bit, and then we're going to see if we turn back down as time goes on. On SoFi, we have support at 29, resistance at 31. Might bounce towards the low 30s before it turns back down, so give that some time. AMD is also dipping right here. Keep in mind on the daily time frame, we also happen to have these gaps. There's a big gap down here at 234. I would like to see us fill that gap in November before we try to bounce. So we might bounce a bit before we turn back down, so give this the time it needs. ARM also has resistance around 169 and support down here at 165, so we'll see how it goes. Look for a temporary bounce before we turn back down. PayPal is also on a bit of a downtrend, could be dipping back down to 67. Coinbase has resistance at 345, and then we're going to see if we turn or not. It could be retesting basically 345 before it turns back down to 326. Amazon's going to gap up, and it's going to have a giant gap up, and it may even continue to pump. It's up 13%. There is more upside potential, in my opinion. For Meta, we have resistance around the 689 area. It might try to bounce for like 680 to 685, and we'll see if it rejects for some temporary upside. Google may also retest 187. We'll see how it goes. I do see some upside potential. And then Microsoft is going to likely retest 530, and then we're going to see if it rejects and turns back down towards 515. If anything, it's been making lower highs, so be very careful with this. Oracle may also retest essentially 265, and we'll see how it goes. So, with that being said, the VIX is also trying to bounce a bit. Can it get back above 17.55 soon, or does it continue to reject? We'll have to see how it goes. For now, the VIX is looking a little bit weak. It's actually kind of like flat right now, not really doing a whole lot. The 10-year went up because of Jerome Powell's note about what's happening with the current interest rates in December, as we don't truly know what's going to happen with them. That led to some uncertainty, which is why yields went up. The dollar's also up, and so is crude, which is kind of flat. It's not really affecting things. So I think we try to gap up tomorrow and try to pump a little bit on Tesla. We may even retest the low 450s, but be very careful because we could be forming a head and shoulders like pattern, and we're not done with this gap. We'll back down towards like 434s. Look for a gap up and a push on Tesla before we turn back down. So be very, very careful just in case we kind of like pump like this and then kind of like turn back down to fill this gap. So watch that very closely, at least for Tesla stock. With that being said, I want to thank you all so much for listening. Don't forget, SPY and the QQQ have plenty of gaps left to fill below. We're going to try to gap up tomorrow, most likely, and we're going to try to push. But this push may be very, very temporary because, once again, It is the last Friday of the month, so there will be some manipulation. And even if the market kind of gaps up and gets a green close, it's going to be fine as long as you don't break the all-time high. The bearish thesis is still present as we have some gaps to fill. Once again, I would like to see us fill the gaps. I'd like to see us turn down to start off November. And then the last 2 weeks of November, the last 2 or 3 weeks of November could be very bullish after that. So there's a good chance of that potentially happening. So with that being said, I want to thank you all so much for listening. I hope you guys have a very, very awesome rest of your guys' days. Get ready for a temporary bounce on Tesla, which could lead to some more of a decline later on. I just want to give you guys a very unbiased view of that. And I'll see you guys tomorrow before market open. Until then, I wish you all nothing but the best and peace out.